All right, ladies and gentlemen, happy Tuesday. I appreciate your attention for today's lesson as I have just recently left the building for the day. Yesterday, you guys took your Chapter 8 tests. Hopefully, you'll get them back by Friday. I've already started to work on those grades. I also will have your projects for you at the beginning of next week as well. If you did not hand in a project or take the Chapter 8 test, feel free to see me tomorrow. As far as the backpack goes, after the conclusion of today's lesson, feel free to work on any of your homework assignments that have been printed. All right, I am aware, obviously, you guys have your Bronx Zoo trip on Thursday. So you'll see that nothing's due there Thursday, but nonetheless, some Section 1 stuff, key terms that were due today, I'll check tomorrow. Your questions are due tomorrow for Section 1. Your Section 2 key terms are due Friday, and then your questions then on Monday as well. Just two things that I've explained to each of my classes today that I just wanted to be abundantly clear with each and every one of you. Mr. Fiore and I spoke. As of today, we have 8 days left in the trimester. And one of those days is for your Bronx Zoo trip. One of those days will be for a comp review. And obviously, that doesn't give us much time to go through Chapter 9. So what we decided to do is we are going to give you a Chapter 9 assessment next Wednesday. Okay, the assessment's going to be a little bit longer than a quiz. It's going to be shorter than a standard test. There will be no written section. It'll be a combination of true and false, matching column, and multiple choice questions. But instead of counting it as 2 quiz grades, we're going to count it as a test grade. All right, so I think it's an easy way, since it's only going to really cover the first 3 sections here of Chapter 9, an easy way to get a good test grade heading into the end of the trimester. Okay, couple that with your projects. Hopefully we'll be able to see an increase in your test averages moving forward. So next Wednesday, based off of the next 5 lessons, we are going to do an assessment. I'm not calling it a test. I'm not calling it a quiz. I don't want to call it a quest. I'll call it an assessment right now that will count as a test grade. So we'll talk a little bit more about that on Friday before you guys break for the weekend. In addition, your trimester review sheets have been sent out to you. If you guys have any questions on that, it's similar to the first trimester review sheet. Take a look at it, make the proper notation on it, maybe this weekend, or if you have some free time during the week, since technically speaking, our trimester is 2 weeks from today. All right, so April 16th, 2 weeks from today, 11:05, your trimester review, your trimester exam. So if you have any questions, feel free to see me. But nonetheless, the way we left off Chapter 8 was actually a perfect segue into Chapter 9, as we talked about the fallout from John Adams' presidency. And picking up from our conversation on Friday, we had said that John Adams, due to the fact that he was the president after George Washington, he had a Republican vice president throughout his 4 years in office. He dealt with the fallout with the Jay's Treaty and the XYZ affair in France. He dealt with dissension within his own political party. And then to kind of top matters off, the Alien and Sedition Act, people were very critical as to why those acts and when those acts were passed, especially the Sedition Act, and that it was a violation of freedom of speech. So with all that said, the election of 1800 played out where John Adams is not going to win re-election. And instead, as we said Friday, we see Thomas Jefferson and another Republican, Aaron Burr, actually tying in the Electoral College with 73 votes apiece. And as a result, the election of 1800 is not going to come down to a recount. It's going to come down to a vote now in the House of Representatives. As per the Constitution, if no single party is to win a majority of the electoral votes, it would be the House of Representatives that will decide now who is going to become president. And for the Federalists in the House, this is their worst nightmare. Their candidates to vote for are 2 Republicans. And vote after vote after vote, ballot after ballot is submitted, and nor Jefferson nor Burr will win a majority of those votes. It is not until Alexander Hamilton hits to the press, hearing about what's going on, that he gives his kind of 2 cents into, if he were a member of Congress, what would he do? And he clearly stated that if he were president, he would have most likely voted for, if he was in the House of Representatives, he would have most likely voted for Thomas Jefferson. He figured that Jefferson would do right by the country, and he referred to Thomas Jefferson as the lesser of 2 evils. because Hamilton from the state of New York, knew firsthand kind of about Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr didn't really see eye to eye with Alexander Hamilton. On the very next ballot, as it so happens, Thomas Jefferson will win the majority needed in the House, therefore becoming the third president of the United States, while Aaron Burr will become the vice president. And that in itself sets up a long-lasting feud that we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow in regards to Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Some sense of irony here, and Jefferson and Hamilton, who were sworn enemies with the creation of political parties, it is Hamilton that is going to tip the scales in Jefferson's favor in becoming president. What people begin to realize, though, especially in Congress moving forward, is that there's a conversation that there's probably a flaw in the Constitution, and that flaw is in the Electoral College. Whoever wins the most electoral votes becomes president. Whoever wins the second most becomes vice president. What people in Congress begin to realize is that the way that political parties have formed, we have to change the Constitution. And therefore, the 12th Amendment is going to be proposed and passed by 1804. Ironically enough, or conveniently enough, just before the election of 1804. What the 12th Amendment says is that electors now in the Electoral College will get 2 votes still, but now their votes will be split. Okay, so an elector like myself would get 1 vote for who I think should be president and 1 vote who I think should be vice president. So this will start a long-lasting tradition of presidents beginning to think about choosing a running mate. Who does the party want to nominate as president and vice president? So in the election of 2016, we saw Donald Trump choose Mike Pence to be his vice president. So on election night, via the Electoral College, technically speaking, when the electors get together in December to vote, 1 vote is given technically to Donald Trump, 1 vote is given to Mike Pence, and that's how those 2 are put into power. That's more of a tradition now, choosing who would become their running mates, so to speak. So the 12th Amendment changes the way that we vote for a president in the Electoral College, okay, where 2 electoral votes, 1 are cast for the president and 1 cast to the vice president. With the election of 1800, not only a historic and famous election because of the tie, but also because it is at the turn of the century. And Thomas Jefferson, who was not only the first Republican voted in as president, but is also the first president who will be inaugurated in our nation's new capital of Washington, D.C. With our 45 presidents, only 1 has not served a single day in Washington, D.C., and that is, ironically, George Washington. Washington, D.C. Was at that time being built. John Adams will serve less than a year as president in our nation's capital, but Thomas Jefferson is, in fact, the first to be inaugurated there on March 4th of 1801. And as you can imagine, the Republican base, those that supported Jefferson, thousands of people will be in attendance of that inauguration. And for Jefferson, he wanted to bring his own traditions and his own beliefs to the presidency. We had made mention when he resigned as Secretary of State back in 1793 under Washington. It was at that time that if Jefferson really wanted to see the changes that he thought should be brought to government, it was going to have to be during his time eventually, if he could become president. So the time is now for Jefferson, as the Republicans will now begin to take charge not just of the office of the presidency, but also their popularity in both houses of Congress. Well, as you can imagine, John Adams, who was not happy with the election results, is not even there at the inauguration, which is an unfortunate set of circumstances when you think about a outgoing president, an incumbent president, being kind of seeing that transition of power. Only 4 presidents were not going to be at their successor's inauguration, and for various reasons, and 2 of which another one we'll get into later this year with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Obviously, John Adams will forever blame Jefferson for his failed presidency. But it is during Thomas Jefferson's inaugural address, an inauguration ceremony that he walked to and from, which is a famous historical fact that he, walked from the president's residence, the White House, to the Capitol building, will make a number of promises to the American people. And he also outlines his plans for government. And it is during his inaugural address that he says a few things, but one of the things I take from this is this quote here. And he says this: "Let us then, fellow citizens, with one heart and one mind." Kind of sounds like Jefferson himself attended Kellenberg with the school mantra there. Okay, one heart and one mind. But more importantly, he said this: "Every difference in opinion is not a difference in principle." Famously, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Now, I beg to ask the question: every difference in opinion is not a difference in principle. What did he mean by that? We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Well, if you think about it, with baseball season getting started this past week, I'm sure some of you in here are Met fans. I'm sure some of you in here are Yankee fans. Now, while you may have different opinions on what your favorite team is, the common thing that unites Mets and Yankee fans together is that you gotta like baseball to support that team. Okay, you might think the Mets are better because they got a better coach and better pitchers. You may think the Yankees are better because they have a better lineup. But at the end of the day, Met Yankee fans, they like baseball. That's what Jefferson's saying. He says, regardless of what the Federalists and the Republicans think, they have different opinions, loose and strict interpretation of the Constitution, strong state government, strong federal government, being pro-French or pro-British. What Jefferson is saying in his inaugural address is that the country has to put their differences aside. That at the end of the day, both political parties may have different in opinion, but the one thing that is common amongst the Republicans and Federalists is that they want what's best for the country. And that is what Jefferson's going to try to do throughout his entire presidency, is he is going to, in fact, try to ease party disputes. Now, for him, he saw firsthand how party disputes could ruin a presidency. So I think it was important for him on day 1, March 4th of 1801, that day that he is taking over the office of the president, to say, hey, listen, Federalists and Republicans, we need to get on the same page. Just because we have different opinions, it doesn't need to lead to massive debates or conflict. What we need to do is talk things through and see what's best for the American people and for the American government. And one of the first orders of business is actually Jefferson's going to rename the political party that he helped to form. He wants Republicans to now be known as Democratic Republicans, putting the word democratic in front of Republicans and this idea that a democracy is for the government by the people, a government for the people by the people, and that's exactly what he wants the Republican base to believe. The understanding that not just the government's not formed for the Republican people and by the Republican people, but for all Americans. So what we see, if you were to look up Thomas Jefferson's political party for his presidency, most historians, if not all, will refer to him as a Democratic Republican president. And thus, when we talk about this chapter, it is in fact the era of Thomas Jefferson, where we have 3 consecutive Democratic Republicans elected into office, who will each serve 8 years. So we'll get into that as we go on with the chapter. Many people will note that the election of 1800 in many ways was also the revolution of 1800, and there's that word again, revolution. As we defined earlier in the year, revolution means change, and obviously Thomas Jefferson, as the first Republican, now Democratic Republican president, he does want to bring about a tremendous amount of change. And through campaign promises and through his even his inaugural address, we begin to see 2 major points to the changes that Jefferson wants to make. The first of which is limiting the role of the federal government. For Jefferson, all along, he felt as though the federal government was too powerful. The Constitution in itself, he himself was an anti-federalist. He felt as though that the government was way too powerful. So what he wants to do is begin to limit, the federal government. And the way that he wants to do that, and I'm just going to underline this here, is first by changing the government's economic policy. For Thomas Jefferson, he truly believes that the federal government became way too powerful in its role with the economy, whether it was the creation of the National Bank, whether it was assuming all state and federal debts part of Hamilton's plan, whether it was the implementation of taxes. He felt as though the government was way too much involved, that it was too hands-on. And Jefferson, for his presidency, what he wants to see the government do is take a page out of the French book and what he called a laissez-faire approach. The word laissez-faire means to let alone, And the way to do that is for the government to just kind of let the economy work itself out, okay, without, setting up taxes or what have you. So we are going to see down here, he is going to cut most federal taxes. Okay, his arguments there are that, if people aren't paying taxes, they have more money to spend. And if more money to spend, it's going to help the economy. Okay, so obviously that is a not, government not getting involved in collecting taxes. People are able to spend what they may have done on taxes now more freely in an open market. In order to change the economic policy as well in limiting the role of the federal government is cutting the size of the army. He felt as though that in 1801 the United States was not at war. So why would we continue to fund the building up of an army and a navy, which had been done under Adams, for no reason? So this would be a way to cut government spending, but also to decrease the size, okay, reducing the number of people in government. So tax collectors may have been lost their jobs. We see the size of the army being cut. Okay, at the time of Adams's presidency, he had over 7,000 troops in the army. Okay, by the time Jefferson gets into office in his first year, that number is down to 2,500. Okay, so we'll see as to whether or not that was a good idea. But another big thing that he wants to do is he wants to ease party disputes. Okay, and the way to do that is that although he will cut most federal taxes, he is going to keep a tax on imported goods. Now, why would you say that's more sounds as though the federal government is being involved? And you could be right with that. But keep in mind what we said in the last chapter. The Republicans believed that they got their support from the South, from those that supported agriculture, and the South relied heavily on imported goods. So why keep a tax where those people that you get your votes from would be affected? Well, this was a way to show the Federalists, hey, listen, I'm not reversing all Federalist policies. Import taxes are good in the fact that they, by default, make American products cheaper. That's going to stimulate and get the Federalist base excited. And while Southerners may be upset by this, it's an import tax that is not all that much. Okay, so this was an example of him trying to ease party disputes. You're also going to see repaying the national debt, a Hamilton policy. He's going to look to continue to do that. Okay, some people were concerned that when Jefferson got into office, anyone who associated with Adams and the Federalist Party may be fired. Adams does not want to do that. He is very clear about that. Hey, if you're someone that can do your job well and you're doing what's best for the American people, then you should obviously keep your job. Okay, so some Federalists will keep their job. Obviously, there will be some turnover with those that Jefferson wanted to put into office or to put into power. Some Federalists will be told that they no longer have a job, but some Federalists will keep their jobs. Okay, we do, and some people had brought up relief of the Sedition Act. All right, that act will be immediately repealed when Jefferson gets into office. Again, going back to limiting the role of the federal government, he felt as though that act in itself was ultimately going against the Constitution, and rightfully so. The First Amendment, freedom of speech. Okay, basically an act that said you can't speak out against the government. That act will be repealed to the appreciation of not just Republicans, but also the Federalists, who, as we mentioned, began to lose faith in John Adams. So, in many ways, the Revolution of 1800 is an important thing that comes to define Jefferson's presidency. Okay, and if we were to use this slide as a report card, at the end of the chapter next Tuesday, I'm going to bring this up again, and I'm going to say, listen, did Jefferson follow through with these things? Did he go against some of these things? Did he limit the role of the federal government? Did he ease party disputes? So we can see from there whether or not he lived up to some of the promises made. The last thing I want to talk about today is really what I would consider to be John Adams's parting gift as president to Thomas Jefferson. And obviously, losing the election of 1800, if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times, Adams is furious and really finger points and blames Jefferson for that loss. So, in order to kind of enact a little bit of, in some ways, revenge, but also to ease Adams's own concerns, he felt as though that if Jefferson was to become president, which he was going to, he was going to reverse all Federalist policies. So in order to assure that all of those policies, work that he did, and even Washington that supported Federalist policies, in order to ensure that they still remained a part of the federal government, Adams is going to pass and push through Congress rather quickly something known as the Judiciary Act of 1801. This act gave Adams permission to appoint a series of district judges, which would be considered federal judges throughout the country, but specifically in Washington, D.C. And the reason as to why judges would be appointed was on the premise that these judges were sympathetic to Federalist policies. They were all Federalist at their core. And over the span of a month, 42 judges will be appointed by Adams, all of which were proclaimed Federalists. So after Adams is no longer president, he heads back to Massachusetts, and as Jefferson starts to get things in order for his presidency, one of his closest friends and the appointed new Secretary of State, James Madison, is a little bit curious as to what the Judiciary Act of 1801 actually did. And Madison brings this to the attention of the president, Thomas Jefferson, and he says, listen, hey, just so you know, Adams appointed a number of judges that I don't necessarily feel as though are within their best intentions. And these judges become known as midnight judges, to a point where Jefferson feels as though that these judges were unfortunately appointed at the wrong time. And what Jefferson wants to do is get rid of them as these district judges. So as a result, what we're going to see is James Madison is going to inform all of these federal judges that they no longer have jobs. Basically, they are losing their jobs. And one of those judges, William Marbury, says, absolutely not. I was appointed by a president. I'm being wrongfully fired and removed from my position as a judge. And if you're going to follow through with this, I am going to sue the federal government for my job, and rightfully so. So this is going to start a long, drawn-out process that will be highlighted by a very famous Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. And tomorrow we're going to get into the specifics of this feud between Marbury, the federal government, between Madison, Jefferson, and the appointed Adams judges, to a point where this Supreme Court case, if you were to go to law school, will be one of the very first court cases you would study while in law school, because it is going to forever change the relationship between the Supreme Court and the other two branches of government, and even more so, it continues to develop what the Supreme Court can do, okay, which we said was very loosely defined by Article 3 in the Constitution. So tomorrow we'll wrap up with Section 1. We'll get into some very important points of Jefferson's presidency as far as the Louisiana Purchase goes. With your remaining time here in class, feel free to start your homework. Okay, remember your key terms were technically due today, so make sure that those are done for tomorrow. And your Section 1 questions, I had already looked prior to leaving. Some of you have already submitted the homework assignment for tomorrow, which is great. So if you haven't done it, feel free to get that started. As always, please make sure that you are thanking your sub on the way out. Please make sure that you are being respectful for the remainder of class. And I will see you all tomorrow. Take care.